Well, hello, everybody. If you are watching us, courtesy of the Mighty and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, I am so excited to have this conversation. I'm Brett Ween. I'm the Director of Writing and Entertainment Outreach at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And here with me is the star of the show, the title star of Ask Dr. Jill, my amazing colleague, our head of research, Dr. Jill Harkavy-Friedman.
And hi, Brett, and hi to all of you. So glad you're here and that we're going to have this conversation. Really looking forward to it.
Yeah, Jill, I think people in general are really curious about this. So I want to jump in pretty quickly, which is, our sort of general question today is, has the pandemic affected suicide rates? And I know standpoint working at AFSP from the beginning of the pandemic, there have been so many people who've been curious about it, who have made assumptions about it, and which may or may not be correct. And we can talk about how we learn about statistics like these in general, and how and we'll just get into it in terms of how has the pandemic affected suicide rates, or has it at all?
I think that's a question that everybody's been wondering about, and it's something that the whole world globally, we've been wondering about it. As representing AFSP, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, I'm part of a COVID collaborative that we have regular meetings trying to figure out. So I think first I want to say that every life matters. So even though we're talking about suicide rates, which is like the big number across people, I want to just keep in mind that we're talking about people who lose their lives and people who are affected by that. So as we talk about these numbers, let's also think about the people who are affected. The other thing is that you've probably heard a lot about suicidal ideation increasing. And so I want to make the point that while there's a relationship between people who think about suicide, people who make suicide attempts, and people who die by suicide, it's not a straight line. So if you think about it, a lot of people think about taking their lives either briefly or at a deeper level. And the estimate is about 12 to 15 million people in the United States have those thoughts. Then it's estimated that about 1.4 million, so that's a tenth of the people, actually make a suicide attempt. And please keep in mind that 95% of those people will not die by suicide. So when we're talking about suicide rates and suicide deaths, we're talking about a smaller, more unique group of people. So I'm saying that because I don't want us to confuse thinking about it and actually dying by suicide. And that's because the distress level around the world has been high. People have felt more depressed. People are actually report thinking about suicide, more people thinking about it. Fortunately, that does not seem to have translated at this point or through the pandemic to an increase in actual deaths by suicide, which is the good news, And in part, I think there are a few factors related to that. One is, since the first day almost of the pandemic, we've been talking about our mental health, that this is a stressful time. We need to pay attention to our mental health, take care of our mental health. We did a Harris poll that showed that almost 70% of people, just even 6 months in, were doing something and multiple things to take care of their mental health. So that's a real plus, because mental health is a component of suicide deaths. But it's also, I think, because there's no single cause of suicide. So it's not like the pandemic in itself is suddenly going to make people kill themselves. Suicide is complicated, it's complex. There are many factors that go into it. So the thinking is that it's possible for somebody who has a number of risk factors, mental health conditions being one of them, also chronic pain, chronic health conditions, head trauma, family history and genetics, early life trauma and abuse. All those factors taken together might put somebody at greater risk. And then you have a stressor like the pandemic which really taxes the people, particularly who are at risk. It taxes all of us, but it doesn't make us all think of killing ourselves. That's why we need to help the people who it does lead them down that path. So you have all these biological, psychological, social, and environmental factors that contribute to someone's risk of suicide, and it's not static. It's not still. Sometimes risk is up and down and up and down, and risk is individual. And then you have these life events or stressors, and then of course you have to have access to lethal means. And so we've been talking a lot about reducing people's access to lethal means in times of stress. And research has shown that you can reduce the rate of suicide up to 40% just by not having ways to kill yourself available. Because often actual suicidal behavior happens in the moment. And in that moment, the person is in terrible pain. They're thinking that there's no hope, that they're not connected to people. They feel, even though they may know people love them, they feel they'd be better off with them gone, which we know is not true. So in that very quick moment, that could be as short as 10 minutes, not having access to a way to kill yourself could save a person's life. And it's also because of how the brain works in that moment. In that moment, the person doesn't have access to their usual coping abilities. So their brain is kind of stuck and it's not very flexible. So if you don't have a way right in front of you, you may not think of an alternative, and the moment may pass. Now, the distress may not pass, but the suicidal crisis may pass. Even if someone does try to kill themselves in that moment, if they don't have access to something lethal, they may hurt themselves, but they won't die. And remember what I said, most people who try to kill themselves go on and stay engaged in life. It's a big problem. Almost 50,000 people die by suicide, but fortunately, most people who think about it don't actually die. So what happened in the pandemic? We don't know. We actually did a lot of things that could help prevent suicide. And those include attending to mental health, like I said, increasing access to mental health care and physical care. Telemedicine has been a tremendous help to people who needed to get assistance. In addition, helping people take care of their basic needs in a crisis. So that's food, work, in our society, money, housing. Helping people to take care of those things in a crisis can help reduce the risk of someone entering a suicidal crisis. And we did that. We had all those things in place. I want to say we're still in the pandemic, so we don't know what'll happen next. But so far, the news is good, that while people are feeling very distressed, and even more kids are going to hospital emergency rooms, we see that as they're going there to get help. They're probably telling somebody, and they're getting help so that they don't die by suicide. So yeah. So Brett, you want to chime in here?
No, I didn't want to cut you off. I just that's all so helpful, and I want to sort of say, in other words, just to even loop back in to the beginning, is that I think from what I've been hearing, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, is that people made these assumptions that, I've heard stress and depression and things like that are going up, so that must mean the suicide rates are going up. But and in fact, let me read. And what you're saying is that almost counterintuitively, that's not true. The two things aren't connected. Just because a lot of us are experiencing more depression and anxiety, or even increased suicidal thoughts collectively, that is not actually bearing itself out in terms of people actually taking their own lives.
Right. I want to say something about the numbers, though, before you read. I'm curious what you're going to read, which is that in 2018 and 2019 in the United States, the rates of suicide, the overall rates went down a little bit. And we don't know if that's natural fluctuation or if that's going to be a trend of going down. There's an estimate of the new numbers, and it's kind of back to where it was in 2017. looks like it's about 14 people per 100,000. But again, we don't know if that's natural fluctuation, but it's not this huge change that people thought would happen. And that's good news. And that's true around the world, by the way. Most countries, the rates have stayed the same or decreased, except Korea and Japan for other reasons.
And I also want to point out that, because this is something that I didn't realize before starting to work at AFSP, is that we don't get the numbers. It's not like we're seeing the changes immediately in real time. What is that? Can you talk for a second?
Yeah.
And then we should go to some questions. But
so of course the words that came up to me were supply chain. It's kind of like everything is delayed, as are the CDC numbers on suicide. Now there's different sets of numbers. So you might have even seen some numbers and rates from what's called CDC Wonder, which is the database on all deaths. At AFSP, we wait until the WSCARS data, and I don't know what WSCARS stands for, so I'm not even going to try that. But the WSCARS data comes out because those data are specifically related to self-injurious behavior. And so they're a little bit more refined, they're a little bit cleaner. The absolute number will probably be the same, but the finer tuned data won't be. So we're waiting. That usually comes out in December, early January. I have spent New Year's Eve on the numbers. Here we are in almost mid-February, and we've been told they're coming out any day now. So that's why you may have seen some numbers. It actually takes about 2 years, 1 to 2 years, to get the data because it's not an automatic. We don't have a national database. So every state collects their data from their counties, who collect their data from the hospitals. And certain kinds of death, particularly suicide, needs follow-up. You need to have investigations. It takes time to make that determination most of the time. Obviously, if somebody leaves a note that's saying they're killing themselves, which is only about 17% of people who die by suicide, then they can say it was definitively a suicide. But a lot of times there needs to be an investigation. So then it takes from the hospital to the county to the state to the central repository to get those data together. And so that's why it can take up to 2 years. That's why we're talking about 2020 when it's 2022. Now, there are some provisional data that are coming out these days, and they're quarterly, so we can get estimates closer to the 2-year period. But we're working with the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention. I'm on the Data Surveillance Task Force. We're trying to get the numbers quickly, but it does take a while to get the real numbers.
Right. So that's always been interesting to me. So I want to jump in with some questions. Okay. And so you've touched on some of this a little bit already, but and we've gotten a bunch of questions. Some of them I'm going to sort of package up together because they're similar. One person writes in and this is the big question: suicide rates, have they increased? And another question is, and this one, look at how there are assumptions within the question. How much higher have suicide rates been since COVID started? That person is essentially asking the same question, but they're working into it this assumption that they have that the suicide rates have increased. So have they increased? I just want to be clear about this for people.
It's not really looking at like it has increased overall to date. There are some groups that look like they might have increases, more likely to have an increase. And it looks like that is making minoritized populations. And in particular, Black males. The rate is high, unfortunately, among Native American, Alaskan Americans as well, and that's gone up. That's particularly, again, young men, but also young women, mostly teenagers. So for women, there doesn't seem to be the same ethnic difference, racial difference, but for men, it looks like the rates may be increasing a little bit more for Black men. And we don't really know what that's about, but we do know that exposure, I just read a paper today that confirmed what we've all been thinking, which is that people who are essential workers in the workforce, and in particular, sometimes minoritized populations who had to go to work when all of us were lucky enough to be able to work from home, they were exposed to COVID more. It's not that they were at greater risk for COVID, they were exposed to the infection. So that means that in those populations, there was more loss, more death, more impact, more stress, because going to work in the middle of a pandemic is highly stressful. And so early data are suggesting that perhaps Black males have a slightly increased rate of death. There's some discussion that hasn't been clarified yet about young people, teens to early 30s. And mostly when we're talking about young people, it's the 25 to 35 range. But we don't know yet for sure if rates have increased in that. For whites and for women, the rate went down a little bit. But again, we're waiting for the final data. We don't really have those data now. But we know that it didn't go up enormously. We know that there haven't been huge increases. And it's like when someone dies by suicide and you realize they had life stressors, a lot of times you think, oh, well, this happened to them and that happened to them, and that's the reason they took their life. But like I said before, it's really complicated. That only happens to a person who's already got multiple risk factors. So, if somebody gets divorced or loses their job, most people will not kill themselves. But if you're at risk and you don't have the protective factors and you have access to lethal means, that moment in time with the stress can precipitate it, but it doesn't cause it. So it's the same for the pandemic. It looks, we wouldn't necessarily expect it to cause it across the board, but for people who are at risk to begin with, one might think that it would help. Now, we've come together as a society. We've reached out. We've been using like the internet, like we are right now, to connect with people. And those kinds of things can help. The government support for finances and housing and food, those kinds of things can help. But it doesn't look like the rates are going up. Short answer, no, it doesn't look like the rates are going up in any marked way.
Thank you, Jill. And so to kind of summarize, it looks like overall the rates actually haven't increased, but we really need to pay attention to specific groups,
Yes.
because they may have been affected more.
Exactly. When you're talking about any specific group, it's nothing about that group that puts them at higher risk, because and we want to keep in mind that most people in that group are not taking their lives. But one of the helpful things about thinking about different groups that are affected is sometimes we don't have a message for everybody. Like the message for everybody is we all have mental health. We need to take care of it. But the ways in which we take care of it and the smaller messages really vary from culture to culture, from community to community. And so by identifying groups that had higher rates, it doesn't mean they were at higher risk. It means that more people died. So we want to make sure we're talking to communities where they are at, meeting people where they are at, and not just talking so that most people can't even connect with what we're saying. So it's really helpful to know we're different ethnicities and genders and all kinds of factors where those groups are, so we can have more personalized conversations.
Yeah, and I want to throw in a quick plug to something coming up on the 24th, which is the latest in our Elevating Voices Town Hall series. Is specifically going to be about, the title for our next one is Coming Together to Prevent Suicide in Black Communities. And I think that's going to be an incredible conversation. So on the 24th, so maybe we can have a link to that below here.
Yeah, I think it'll be a great conversation. We've got some great people.
Exactly. They're really the top minds in that specific topic. I want to get to the next question, which I think is a natural progression for this conversation, is a bunch of people wrote in with questions about which age groups have been most affected during the pandemic in terms of suicide.
So, that's an interesting question. I think it's not really well known that the middle and older age groups have higher rates of suicide deaths than the younger groups, because because things like teen suicide are so devastating. Not that every suicide isn't, but with kids, we're shocked. But fortunately, while too many die by suicide, close to 5,000, the rates have been highest in the middle to upper age. But what we are also seeing is that visits to emergency departments for suicidal thoughts and behavior are increasing among our youth. And I kind of see that as, like I said, a good sign, because it means maybe they're talking more when they're feeling distressed and they're trying to get some help. So again, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, no, but just one of those sort of like ironic or paradoxical kind of interesting things when we talk about this, because when people first hear, oh, there are more people like going to the hospital because they're having suicidal thoughts, that sounds like a really negative thing. But in fact, the negative version of that would be if people were just sitting in silence and not reaching out for that help and getting it, and possibly even taking their lives or just suffering. So it's
Exactly.
actually, you can look at it as an incredibly positive thing. Like, oh, that's
That's how
great.
I
More
see it.
people are.
And it's
Um,
interesting because there's distress line, and then there's a suicide crisis, National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, the number 800-273-8255 that we keep flashing. There was a huge increase in calls to the distress line. So I think that really highlights people are distressed. I don't know about you. I have experienced distress. And at this point in the pandemic, it's a different point. First, we had just people dying and no vaccine, no way to help them. Then we got a vaccine. And now we know a lot more about treatment from COVID. So it's not like the entire pandemic is the same. But now we're in a part of the pandemic where we're a little unsure. Do we go back to normal? Do we not go back to normal? Our young ones have truly been affected by, having a 4 or 5-year-old who has to wear a mask and be afraid of going near people, maybe being home for a year. Those things have an effect, not all bad, by the way, but it's different. I mean, these kids are going to have a different experience of growing up than the rest of us.
yeah, I want to pick your brain a little bit and taking some other questions
Yeah, let's do that.
that are coming up. But specifically, I mean, you're leading into what I think the next questions are. A bunch of people have asked about how the pandemic has been affecting just on a broad level, young people versus old people. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think parents are concerned about their kids, and I think, but also, what is it psychologically that this is doing to us, depending
Right.
on whether you're young versus old.
And, of course, I do not have the answer to that. We also know that more older people have died from COVID. On the other hand, as my colleague and friend Yates Conwell would say, who works with older people, the topic of death is not new to them. They know their friends are dying. They know it's there. They're more comfortable talking about it. But the older people may be feeling more isolation if they don't have access to things like internet and online communication. But the young kids have had their life so dramatically changed. And by the way, some kids report great relief because they're relieved of the social strains of being in a school environment. And then other kids feel that they feel just distraught about not being able to be with their friends. So there's no universal experience. And I think it all comes down to the ways in which, and also let's remember, for those people who have young kids, the parents' lives have been uprooted and changed. Plus, they may not even be going into work. They may be trying to work from home. I mean, there's so many parameters. It's not just kids are affected this way and adults that way, but everybody's been affected. For kids, some kids feel more socially isolated. Their kids are saying, I wasn't in a school building. I started in 8th grade and now I'm in 11th grade. And I really didn't have those experiences in between. So I think the thing to keep in mind is that, first of all, I think most people are more distressed. most people are doing things to take care of that distress. Kids have their own set of outlets, but for all of us, staying connected is a really important way to help people who are in distress. It's really interesting that it's connection. And in part, that's because when you're in a suicidal crisis, you might experience connection differently. So if you're able to stay connected with the people, whether they're old or young, and you're able to help people feel safe, and I think with kids, this is a big issue, that the sense of safety, can I touch things? Am I going to give something to somebody, is very confusing and scary. But I think addressing mental health, talking about coping, talking about how to cope with this, what's going on, having real conversations about managing stress, whether it's taking time to breathe, doing some exercise, attending to the basics, food, water, sounds silly, but water, exercise, sleep, helping to have a sleep routine during these, not routine times, and being connected. These things make a big difference for how anybody, but particularly kids, are going to experience the pandemic.
So for parents, would you say, just kind of have conversations about those things and try and encourage and make sure that the kids are, getting enough sleep and they've got a healthy schedule where they're getting outside a bit and talking to their friends in whatever way feels safe? Is there anything you'd add on
Yeah.
to that kind of thing from a parental point of view?
So also from a parental point of view, a lot of parents spend time trying to keep their kids offline, which, online has some real benefits too. But now we have a time where they're online all day long, and the only way they can connect with many of their peers is online. So all those, certainties are gone as well. So I think having some fun and downtime, talking about your own stress, it's okay to let kids know that that this is a stressful time and how you might be experiencing it, and talking about it. But big problems like finances, like work, those things are best kept between parents, because kids developmentally hear things differently. You probably know that life is more nuanced than your 5-year-old knows. And so that what they hear may be very concrete to them. If you say, I'm having trouble at work, I might lose my job, they may think that means tomorrow morning you'll be out of work and then we won't have anything to eat. And it goes, it does a whole thing. So keeping the adult stressor management things in a more private settings, and not really including kids in the details of it, is more helpful to kids as well. Also, I think, we've been reading that a lot of families, the structure has changed, like particularly for women who've had to leave the workforce to take care of their kids. That's a huge, huge difference. Of course, there are men who are doing that as well. But so talking about the impact of those changes and how you're doing and how you're coping and managing, and let's go have some fun. Those are all great things to do with your kids. Also, how are you feeling? This is hard. How are you doing with it? I'm finding it hard. I have to remember to breathe. What are you doing? Just real conversations.
That's great. I want to take a really specific question that we've gotten, because I just don't want to ignore it. And I also want to encourage people, we've got about half an hour left, so keep sending in your questions. If you are right now, you can just fit in. So this question, I'll go ahead and read. I have a friend who's been declared 100% disabled due to their military service. On top of that, they have fibromyalgia. They mentioned in passing that they are contemplating suicide, but didn't express that there was a large threat of follow through. What can I say to them? They are getting therapy.
That's a really important question. I think we're all, we have people of all kinds who we hear that and we don't know what we should do with it. And so what we've been talking about is having a conversation. If you ask someone, first start off with they've already told you a lot about how they're doing. And so just starting the conversation with, how are you managing, how do you need anything to help you function because they have a disability? How's your pain level and your fatigue? Because those are things that go along with fibromyalgia. And then saying, sometimes when people feel like that, they think about ending their lives. And in fact, you told me you had thoughts of killing yourself. So let's talk about that. What are you thinking of feeling, and how can I help you? You don't have, sometimes helping them is just being present. Could be helping them with house chores. It could be helping them get to help. Because when somebody's feeling that way, as I mentioned, they don't have as much flexibility and capacity in their thoughts to get the help they need. So we're going to share some resources where you can help people find help in the chat. But let's face it, finding mental health care is not that easy. And so it's a process. So if you can have that conversation with your friend, say, I've heard or I've learned that there are things that can help people who are feeling like this, and also things that can help you manage any suicidal ideas so that you don't act on them during this most difficult time. So can I help you get help? And then making the phone calls and finding the therapist. What I would say is with telemedicine and telehealth, you can find those resources online. And so it's a lot easier. If you know you have a specific health condition, there's probably an association or society of people who help people with that condition, just like we have for suicide. So there's the Diabetes Association, the Heart Association, I think there's a Fibromyalgia Association. People, if you contact those associations, they often know about resources that may be specific to whatever you're experiencing. But the key thing is you're not going to make somebody think about killing themselves just by asking them. As I said, suicide is really complex and there's no one cause. But just asking them about it and be specific. Are you thinking of killing yourself? Because sometimes when we say suicide, people have all different ideas about what that means. Just ask them and then have a conversation. Find out if it's an emergency. Most times it's not an emergency. It's just a sign that it's time to get some help and intervene. So have a conversation, find out what that person needs, and then help them get it. Remove access to lethal means if you can. Or ask them, we say it as if the person doesn't have any say about it, but like in a safety plan, which is one of the things people can develop to help them stay alive during those times, that person has to put down how they will remove access to lethal means. So it's not something we do to people. It's something we have a conversation about and help them do it. So just you won't know exactly what to say, but just having a conversation brings great relief to people who are thinking about it. And they may not tell you on the first time. I just want to say, they may not say, oh, yes, I'm thinking of killing myself. I'm so glad you asked. They may say, no, I'm fine. But if they don't look fine, take some time and then come back to them. And, Brett, my 4 words: compassion, respect, patience, and persistence. Those are the 4 words I use to guide myself. And I think they're helpful in that situation. Have compassion for them and what they might be feeling. And compassion involves hope that it'll get better. Right? Empathy is you're feeling what they're feeling, but compassion involves you understand and there are ways to get better. Respect we all deserve. Who doesn't feel better when you're respected? Patience, to take the time, and persistence. Come back again. And even if you have that conversation, come back again after that conversation and check in with the person.
Yeah, I also wanted to, and so I just wanted to highlight, just in case anyone missed it, like the basic thing you're saying, which I was going to bring up too, is people, I think, sometimes worry if they notice a friend not acting like themselves and their gut is telling them something seems off. People will often worry that if you ask someone directly, are you thinking about killing yourself, that it'll put the idea in their head or it'll actually push them to do it. And all the research shows that that's not true. It's the exact right thing to do. Ask them directly. And I was going to... I was just going
to say that when people have a secret, it becomes bigger. Mm-hmm. Like, think about when you have a surprise party, right? Suddenly you're with the person and all you want to tell them is that they're having a surprise party, but you don't. So you're holding it in and you're feeling pressure. But that's what happens when somebody has something like they're thinking of killing themselves and they can't tell someone. It becomes a pressure to them. So when you have that conversation, it can relieve that pressure. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I was also going to say, you mentioned, Jill, that sometimes the person won't admit it right when you ask them. And I'm thinking, if you put yourself in the mind of someone who is experiencing that level of pain, or really thinking about suicide, I think from their perspective, for some of them, there's sometimes a fear that if I tell this friend of mine or family member, all of a sudden the cops are going to be here, they're going to call the police, or they're going to have me committed, or something like that. So what advice can you give, Jill, to from either point of view, either what would you say to someone who has those concerns because they are thinking about suicide and they're worried about what's going to happen if they tell someone,
Mm-hmm.
and also from the other point of view, if you're worried about a friend of yours or a family member and they're not opening up, is there anything you can say to that person?
Right. So first, with the person who is thinking about it, I do think, as you're saying, it's really important to say, you can even say in the olden days, I know they used to just bring people to the hospital, but we have things we can do now. I've learned from AFSP that we actually have treatments now that can help people to manage their ideas and help you to have a better life, and a life that is worth living. So I'm not gonna, unless you're right this second going to do something, what I really want to do is just have a conversation and help you get help. And by the way, sometimes when people are really in distress, they appreciate if you call the hospital or drive them there. If you do drive them there, make sure to put the child lock on the door. I know that sounds, but just to be safe, so they can't open it from the inside. The thing is, when you call the police have to handcuff you. It's hard to put a person who may be at imminent risk in the ambulance because there are tubes and wires and scissors and all kinds of things that can't be kept out. And so they have a protocol. And so if you do call the police, which let them know the person doesn't have a weapon, that changes things. And try to have it be as respectful as possible, but understand that they have to keep the person safe. But now there's going to be more crisis centers and many more opportunities. So I let people know we can have a conversation. I'm not going to rush you to the hospital and say that you're crazy. I just want to help you get help.
Go ahead.
Oh,
go on. No, you go on, Jill.
I was going to say, on the flip side, if someone says no and you're still worried about them, which happens a lot, actually, I would say, well, I'm concerned about you. This is what I see. I see that you're not sleeping, you're isolating, you look tired, you're not even showering. Those are all signs to me that you're not feeling well. So if you're not thinking about suicide, I accept that. But I want you to know that if you are, you can tell me about it. Or find someone else that can tell about it. If you're not the one, you can, contact your parents or your friend or this, and give them the Lifeline number and the crisis text line number that are both on the bottom of your screen. Like, I really encourage you to either get one of the cards that has that information on it, or write it down on a piece of paper, or ask them to put it in their phone, and then leave it and say, I just want you to know this is here in case you need it. And here's my phone number. And say it's not over. The conversation is, we're just starting the conversation. But I'm not afraid of you because you might be thinking that.
So I want to raise this question that I think people often ask, and it's a really important question. A lot of people really are concerned about calling the police and what will happen, and especially depending on what group they might be a part of. Like some people have very reasonable concerns.
Yeah.
So for someone who is concerned about a friend or a family member and thinks that they are thinking about suicide, should they call the police, or am I correct in thinking that maybe what they might want to do is call up the suicide prevention Lifeline or text the crisis text line themselves to get advice, unless it's a really imminent Like they think that someone is actually going to take action against themselves in that moment, in the next moment or two, in which case, then yes, they need to call the police.
Right.
Do I have that right? I want to make sure.
Absolutely. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline will help you figure out how to help somebody. But remember, when you call the crisis line, the goal is to get you to treatment. So if you or the person is already in mental health treatment, they may recommend that they call their mental health provider, which can sound sometimes like not very helpful, but it's also something people often forget to do is to call their provider. So, but the Lifeline is there to help you help somebody else. Also, in terms of resources, you can come to our website. We have all kinds of resources on the website, both general and for specific groups and populations. And call and help, or if you're in therapy, ask your therapist. Helping someone is stressful, but it's better than not helping them.
Yeah, and I just want to say also, I think people sometimes even worry that if they call the Lifeline or the crisis text line, that is going to then immediately become they will call the police. And I can say that's really not true. Again, it's only if they think you are in imminent serious danger of doing something. But I'm on a committee for the Lifeline, and so and Jill knows also, like, they take these kinds of things very seriously. Their intent is not to just call the police. Their intent is to help the person themselves, or help the person who is concerned about someone else, and help, strategize what to do. So I think if you're concerned about, calling the Lifeline or the crisis text line, that's not a concern you really have to have. It's not a thing where suddenly you're going to have police cars outside your house just because you're having thoughts of suicide.
Because most situations can be de-escalated. Suicide risk is like, it can crescendo, it can really increase. But if you give it some time, most of the time it will drop back down for a while. So the risk might be there for a while, but the immediate risk may pass. And so that, if you can get through those periods, that can help to then if the person, to get somebody to therapy, or if they're in therapy, to work with their clinician, and if we're seeing a psychiatrist for medication, to work to realign things. But it's really getting people through that immediate crisis, for the crisis text line and National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, but trying to help people upstream before the crisis is important. But I do want to say that while we do have ways, we didn't used to have interventions that could help people. They used to be think, treat the depression and the suicidal stuff will go away, but that's not actually how it works for many people. But if somebody does take their life, because it happens, we don't have 100% foolproof suicide prevention, at least not yet. Ultimately, when someone dies by suicide, it's their action. It may be, based on a brain that's not working properly, and they don't have access to coping. But you can't cause somebody to take their life. And that means that we can't prevent every suicide. So even if you try and the person does die by suicide, all you can do is know that you tried, and that person wasn't accessible. It's just like heart disease, lots of people have heart disease, and we do things like diet and exercise, and we can reduce the risk. But, heart disease is still the leading cause of death in the United States. We have things that can make it better, that can reduce risk, but we can't reach every single person for a variety of reasons. Life is complicated. And I know when you lose somebody to suicide, there's often a guilt, like, I could have done something, or I should have done something. And what I've learned with my work with survivors of suicide loss is that it's more the hope or wish that you could have done something than actually being able to do more than you did. Because whatever you did was what you knew to do in the time.
That's right. We have a really personal question that I would love to get to, because I think it would be nice to have. I don't want to let it go answered, and someone really opened up about what they're going through right now. So, so just a little bit of a warning about that. Someone writes in, when I have suicidal ideation, I tend to feel like my brain is broken and needs fixing, but I do not know how. I begin to self-loathe. It hurts so much and makes me so sad. I wish I can simply find happiness in my heart and mind. What's wrong with me? I feel as if the universe, God, hates me. As I type, I'm beginning to cry since I'm drowning in hopelessness in this moment. Sharing this out loud creates such vulnerability. And
So
so I wanted to make sure to thank this person for sharing that. And it's so articulate about what they feel in these times.
yeah, I really appreciate it. And you know, of course, that if I had an answer that would make, you know, for you personally, I would give it to you in a second. But I think the feelings that you're expressing are the feelings that many people feel when they're thinking life isn't worth living. And it's, you know, if you can, first of all, there are now there are interventions and treatments that help you to manage those feelings, and then treatments that help you to make your life better. So you need to manage your brain. Your brain is not permanently broken. It may not be working just right, but it's not permanently broken. And something really cool that we found from research is that with treatment, we funded somebody, they took brain images of a person before treatment with dialectical behavior therapy, and then they had therapy, and then after. And the people who did well, their brain function actually changed and improved over the course of treatment. So even if your brain isn't working quite right now, there are things you can learn to do. Now, DBT is great for some people. It might be that cognitive behavior therapy for suicide prevention, or attachment-based family therapy, or CAMS, or other interventions might be more effective for you. And that's what we're trying to figure out now. Not only we're trying to develop more treatments and interventions, but to figure out what works best for who. So that feeling of feeling desperate and like there's no other options, that's the suicidal mind. And that is the result of a lot of factors coming together. And so if you can remind yourself in that moment that that's my, you know, that's my suicidal brain thinking, and I'm going to get through this to a point where that part of my brain doesn't make me act in any way. And hopefully someday those thoughts will be gone, because they can be gone. And getting help, and one of the treatments, especially geared towards managing those thoughts and behaviors, that feeling like you have a broken brain, you know, can be relieved. You may not, you know, we all have things so that we may not feel 100%, but we can feel a lot better and function better and have tools to use when we go to those spaces, you know, and things like a safety plan and a person, a clinician, and also people in your life that you can go to when you have those moments to get through them, and just remind yourself, write it on paper, put it in front of you, have an alarm that says, hey, this will pass, you matter. You know, those sayings can sometimes seem trite, but they're actually really important reminders. They're not cures, but they just remind you, oh, this is my depressed brain, or this is my anxious brain, or this is my suicidal brain talking. But there's a lot more to me than just that aspect of what I'm feeling right now. And thank you so much for sharing that. I know that there are so many people who feel that way, and the brain is involved, but the brain is very flexible. The brain is very plastic. It's just like genetics are involved, but guess what? Only you know, a portion of your experience is directed by genetics, and environment plays a role. So nothing is 100% anything, but it's trying to work with somebody to help you through those times, and finding the right clinician, the right family members and friends. Sometimes family members are perfect, sometimes they're toxic. So it's going to the people who will help you that's going to make the difference. And also talk to your primary care doctor and have a physical, because a lot of times there are medical conditions that may increase things like depression and anxiety and even psychosis, or, you know, unreality. So make sure you have a physical Make sure your eyes are working and your ears are working to really optimize your functioning.
Yeah, I want to thank that person for writing in and being it's always interesting when people can describe what they're feeling and going through. I think that helps other people to hear it and feel a little validated that they're not alone in that. And then to have, Jill, for you to respond in that way, I think is really helpful. Um, there's another question I really want to make sure we get to in the last few minutes. It's really specific, and I think it's interesting to me because I think we're talking in generally about, oh, COVID and the pandemic has affected all our mental health, and there are these new things. But from the point of view of someone who already manages a mental health condition, it can exacerbate it or make it a little bit more complicated or change the way we handle it. So one person writes in, my OCD has gone over the roof since the COVID, thinking I have it or passing it on. I guess they mean thinking that you have COVID. And because you're already experienced OCD, that makes that more challenging. So I thought that was a really interesting question. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, and I think that it's like your OCD expressing itself in another way, like another avenue to worry about, so to speak. And I think that brings us back to what we were talking about in the beginning, which is why it's so important for each of us to take care of our mental health. And if you have a mental health condition, then you might need some tweaking on how you're caring for that condition to make it more effective during times of stress. And that's true not just for COVID, but during other times of stress. We're talking about COVID because it's a stressor. And there are a lot of unknowns and there's a lot of confusion. But it's not just COVID now. There are so many things going on in our society. So if you have a mental health condition, that's a time to make sure you're checking in with your mental health provider, maybe learning a few new strategies, talking about what's not working for you. The only way to find something that will work for you is for your clinician and for you to know what's not working so that you can try something else. And if you're taking medication, medication can be affected by stress or the effect of medication. So make sure to check in with your provider who's prescribing your medication regularly to optimize. And you may need to make some tweaks and some minor changes, or maybe add a medication that you may keep or take up during times that are not as stressful. But it's really, yourself. You know what your symptoms are. You have a sense of what helps. If you feel like nothing helps, that means you need to keep trying till you find the thing that helps. And that's true for a lot of health conditions. For instance, 60% of women over 60, myself included, have thyroid problems, and it takes a while to find the right thyroid level. You take a little too much and you feel this way. You take a little too little, you feel that way. They take blood levels and see where you're at. But actually, you can't say to someone, this is exactly how much you should take. And it changes with stress and illness and things like that. So mental health is like that too. You have to pay attention, work with your providers and your family and your friends or whoever is in your circle. It could be your internet friends for all I know. But whoever is in your circle, let them know how you're feeling. And if you can, let them know what's helpful to you. And so build your entourage, that's what I call it, for your mental health entourage. And rely on them, let yourself rely on them a bit.
We just have a few minutes left. I kind of want to end on one question that kind of widens it out a little bit in a positive way, which is, we're talking a lot about individuals and people we might be concerned about or ourselves. But from a different point of view, considering everything that we're going through right now and all the unique challenges we're experiencing, how can we all create a safer environment in our different realms of life, like our workplace or our schools? Is there anything that the average person can do to influence those environments in a positive way right now?
Absolutely. You can, as an individual or as a community, adopt approaches that are out there. that create an environment. You can't push the whole environment, but there are programs like our More Than Sad, or our interactive screening program, or school programs, community programs that will help, that teach you can actually teach resilience, right? And it's particularly important during times like this, where we've been in this pandemic for 2 years, and we're probably all a little tired of it. But you can refresh and teach skills for resilience. You can bring programs to your community. For instance, the research is showing that school programs for suicide prevention actually reduce the suicide rate in the community. So raising awareness, get involved with us. I mean, we have volunteers in every area giving programs, our walks, just walking with other people, advocating. If you're not an advocate for mental health and suicide prevention, come to our advocacy corner on our website. Learn, do programs, look at our research and everything we've learned about suicide and suicide prevention. Get involved and get the people around you involved, because knowing about suicide, risk factors, warning signs, and what to do is a community effort. You know, it's one of these things that it's a public health problem. The solutions are at every level, at the larger community, in your smaller school or family or workplace. And workplace mental health has become finally an area where even employers are saying, hey, if my team doesn't feel well, they're not going to function well, and then we're not going to function well. So workplace, we have a whole workplace program. So there's lots you can do. I could go on about that forever, but I think it's easier to go to afsp.org and just look around. There's so much information there. So just look around, pick a topic. Next time you come to the website, pick another topic. But we can make a difference together, and there's strength in numbers. So some things we can do on our own, those one-on-one conversations with someone you care about who may be at risk or may be struggling. But as a community, we can gear up, we can get informed, and we can provide resources for those who need them. And those things make a difference. So there's a lot you can do as a community and as a country that we can do to improve mental health and to reduce the rate of suicide. You might also check out our Project 2025, which we set a bold goal to reduce the rate of suicide 20% by 2025. And we picked 4 areas where we can reach enough people. There's lots of different high risk groups and everything, but the question is, where do you find them? Well, our Project 2025 works with healthcare systems, emergency departments, gun owners, and correction systems to reach as many people as we can, to provide the tools for suicide prevention and help reduce the rate of suicide. And every one of you on here, even if you yourself are struggling, can help make a difference in that for yourself and for your community. You're not alone.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good note to end up on. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, everyone who's been watching. And I'll just sort of sum up what Jill was just saying with go to our website. There are a ton of ways you can get involved and information that you can read. And I think I'll even sum up, sorry for the sirens if you can hear that from outside my window, proving that I live in New York City. I just really encourage people to, aside from checking our website, reach out to your local AFSP chapter. We have chapters in every state. Chances are there's one near you. It's easy to find on our website. You type in your zip code. And connecting with your local chapter is, you're going to be meeting with people in your community who already get it. You don't have to over-explain anything about whatever your personal connection is to it. They will get it. And they'll be able to tell you about all the things going on with AFSP, whether it's bringing in an education program to your school or workplace, or loss support services if someone's lost someone. Find your local chapter. It's easy to do, and that's how you're going to find out about all the stuff going on and ways.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brett, for adding that, but also for being my partner here and asking, such important questions. And thank you to all of you who are listening and have, brought your questions forward. really appreciate this opportunity to talk together.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Jill.
Bye.
Take care, everybody.